History doesn't repeat, but it definitely does rhyme. However, those rhymes can become so uncanny that they leave you in complete shock. As I've shown many times before on this show, there are clear cycles of history, and one of the strongest and strangest parallels out there is that between the Romans and Americans. These two empires' histories match in very palpable ways. This video will look into these often startling similarities between two societies and what it could possibly mean for the future. You won't ever see the world in the same way again. The history of Rome fascinates us all, and the many emperors who have come to power have stories that are incredibly interesting. And you can all learn about them in the docu-series I, Caesar. The series covers the most famous leaders of Rome from Caesar to Justinian, and it's truly a magnificent journey through the lives of the emperors and their empire, and it's available only on MagellanTV. MagellanTV is a documentary streaming service made by filmmakers, the best selection of historical documentaries and movies out there. They have content covering everything from the ancient world to current events, and from true crime to astronomy. Magellan's compatible just about any device and is 4K HD with no additional cost. It's a great platform for an affordable price. Regardless of what your interests are, MagellanTV is something for you, be it science, history, philosophy, or anything else. MagellanTV is a wonderful platform, and right now they're offering a 30-day free trial to anyone who uses the link in the description, so check out MagellanTV today. If you start looking for them, you can see some surface-level similarities between the Romans and Americans. Both are superpower republics that rose extremely quickly to rule most of the developed world. Both are ethnic amalgams that showed insane amounts of dynamism. I mean, hell, the United States, and especially its political system, was actively modeled by its founders upon the Roman Republic. This is really just scratching the surface, but I need to explain the theory of civilizational comparison first, and then I'll show the shared histories from there, pointing towards what direction our civilization is headed towards if it follows that history. God willing as well, how we can avoid the worst aspects and failures of classical civilization. There are a couple different cycles of history operating on different timescales. I've covered these in differing detail before on this show, and as you'll see, these cycles' ability to see and comprehend the historic record is shocking if you dig even the slightest amount. There's a generational cycle that lasts around 80 years, a secular cycle that lasts around 250, or a civilizational that lasts 2,500 years. Oswald Spengler developed the idea of the civilizational cycle, showing how civilizations often have life cycles around 2,500 years. Some eerie examples of this are that classical civilization, which I discuss in more depth in this video, was founded around 1400 BC by the Mycenaeans. It reached the point of its greatest philosophic depth in the 5th century BC under Socrates, 1,000 years later, and then 300 years later was ruled by the superpower republic of the Romans that unified classical civilization with massive social problems stemming from it. Meanwhile, Western civilization, which I talk about in this video, was founded around 700 AD, reached the height of its philosophic development in the 1700s, 1,000 years later, and today in the 21st century, 300 years later, is run by a superpower republic with massive social problems that unified Western civilization. You can trace a very similar timescale for almost every civilization that it's uncanny. Although these civilizations do have similar life cycles, there are separate civilizational cycles that are repeated. The fascinating French historian Philippe Fabry has shown how civilizations in the same geographic region often have cycles much more similar to each other than other areas of the world. He gives the common example, shared by another brilliant French historian, Amaury de Riencourt, that classical and Western European civilizations have had very similar life cycles. But you can also see this in the Hebrew, Arab, Assyrian, or Turkish empires in the Middle East, and Amaury suggests India and China have more similar cycles, and I could make the case for the same thing being true among African or New World civilizations that have more similar life cycles than areas outside of their region of the world. Why this is the case, I'm really not sure. Maybe the culture, geography, or genetics of certain continents predestined them towards differing historical trajectories. However, with all these civilizations, for the most part, the modern West and United States share the most with the classical world and the Roman Republic, which I will show by comparing their historical trajectories in this video. I'm going to be pulling very heavily from Amaury de Riencourt's book, The Coming Caesars, which spends 300 pages explaining the comparisons between these two civilizations, while Fabre has expanded upon this, and Spengler was the person who designed the underlying theory they're basing this upon. To reach the point of the Roman Republic in the modern US, we need to see the cultural context they came from. In both the cases of Western Europe and the Greek peninsula, there was a previous advanced civilization, the Minoans or the Romans. Barbarians from the north came down, destroyed said civilization, founding a barbarian kingdom and its remnants, that being Mycenae and the Frankish Empire. After this followed a heroic age, which had many myths of heroic deeds like those of Roland, King Arthur, Siegfried and the like in the west, or Hercules the Trojan War or Jason and the Argonauts in Greece. However, that empire fell apart quickly after further barbarian invasions from the north, those being the Dorians or Vikings. The vestiges of the previous civilization survived in myth either through the Catholic Church or the myths of the Minoans and Bronze Age world. The artistic styles and values of the previous civilizations were forgotten for centuries, and then relearned when these societies had a renaissance, roughly 700 years after the fall of Minoan or Roman civilization. In both cases, there was division between two big blocks. For brutal simplification, the mostly land-facing Germans and the Dorians who destroyed the older states, and the more seafaring Ionians or Latin peoples. The Ionians and Latins both reintroduced civilization to the Dorians and Germans. Meanwhile, there was a savage peripheral large tribal confederacy in the northern wastes, those being the Slavs or Thracians, that gained predominance much later. A merchant minority from the Levant, the Jews or Phoenicians, reintroduced commerce during the Dark Ages and became distrusted. Well, they took technology from the larger and more advanced civilizations of the Middle East, like the Babylonians or Muslims. The jagged peninsulas, mountains, and rough terrain of both the Greek and European peninsulas became divided between new local states, like Sparta, Athens, Thebes, or France, England, Germany, etc. These had tremendous amounts of social unity, nationalism, and generally had parliaments and democratic institutions, much like medieval Europe. There was broader religious unity, an idea of civilizational unity that transcended political differences, including the Olympic Games, the shared Greek pantheon of gods, and the Delphic Oracle, or the Catholic Church and Christianity in Western Europe. Religion dominated and permeated every aspect of life, imbibing ritual and God into every action. Religion provided social unity, and these societies were stable from it, with the idea of reaching spiritual and social stability being seen as the most important, this being the pre-classical and medieval eras. However, an era of religious reform occurred, which took power away from the institutional religions and towards personal faith, thus causing social tension, that being the Orphic or Dionysian cults, which occurred around 700 BC in Greece, versus the Protestant Reformation in Christendom in the 1500s. This era also saw mass colonialism, in which the seafaring nations established colonies all around, but with the largest being to the west of the main area of Greece or Europe. The ethnic Greek or European colonies like the Americas, Sicily, Marseille, and the like often became wealthier and more populous than their home nations. Different Greek and European states colonized competitively, with the national identities being maintained in the colonies. The Greeks and Europeans gained predominance over the seas, becoming the dominant merchant classes and settling around the world's seas like frogs around a pond. This was the 16 and 1700s for the West, and the 600s and 500s BC for the Greeks. This was coterminous with an era of growing rationality and sense of man's ability to be rationally independent from a god's judgment. This started with the pre-Socratic philosophers in Asia Minor and the philosophers of the Enlightenment after the 30 Years' War. Over this era in both Europe and Greece, there was a growing idea that the political order existed to serve the populace rather than being representation of divine right, as we start to see with enlightened despotisms and democracies in England, Athens, and the like. The methods of warfare switched from cavalry-based, which was aristocratic, to ranks of infantry, thus moving away from systems of powerful nobilities to capitalism and populist social models. Now we get to both Socrates and Rousseau's era. This is a tipping point that Spengler made a huge point about. It's probably the most decisive era in a civilization's development, this being the move from culture to civilization. Culture is when a society's still young and it's determining what direction it's going to go into, and still has a lot of creativity. Meanwhile, civilization is what happens when it's largely figured out what its philosophy and direction is, and then solidifies and carries that out. This tipping from culture to civilization takes centuries, and follows a roughly similar direction in each of the world's societies. For China, the Greeks and Indians, their move from culture to civilization started around 500 BC, and finally set into its mold around 200 BC. You struggle to find any cultural forms that changed in these civilizations after 200 BC in a real way, if you don't include the massive enforced changes from colonialism that occurred in India and China thousands of years later due to Western attack. The West's civilizational cycle ended thousands of years later, which is why it was so much more creative than Asia's civilizations when it smashed into them in the 16th through 20th centuries, since the West only reached this point starting with the French Revolution 200 years ago. The tipping point from culture to civilization occurs when a society starts to formulate its logical system. This is since barbarians are close to the earth, and they act as their biology demands, giving them vigor. However, once the elite becomes urban and society needs to manage people rather than fight the natural world, it loses its sense of realness. When the elite becomes urban and a logical system develops, what you're seeing with a set logical system is a society chooses what assumptions it wants to follow and ignores the others, since different civilizations have different systems of logic. One of the things people really struggle to understand is that they assume their logical system is the only logical system a person can use. However, logical systems are dependent upon the cultural context for what assumptions they start with. Burning witches is perfectly logical if you think witches are destroying society. Ignoring the physical world for the spiritual is logical in a Hindu worldview, and honoring tradition and your ancestors above all else is logical in the Chinese worldview. Thus, when a society fundamentally says it prizes quote-unquote logic, what it's really doing is saying, these are the assumptions upon which we will build our society, and we'll ignore anything outside of them. The West's logical views are fundamentally built upon irrational views that come from Christianity, such as the equality of all people, the truth's value for its own sake, or the value of the individual over the group. Once the West made these assumptions quote-unquote logical, they couldn't be contradicted, thus freezing society's culture to greater and greater degrees. However, even though these civilizational cycles often follow similarly broad directions, there are distinctions, and the West and classical civilization did split apart in the directions they took moving from culture to civilization, thus having profound effects upon certain factors that do separate the Romans from modern America. Spengler said classical civilization was Apollonian and the West is Faustian. The classical world pushed for aesthetic and cultural perfection, while the West wants to achieve the most it possibly can. Classical art tries to find perfect proportions, and the West for towering Gothic cathedrals reaching up to heaven. The classical world settled in every geographically perfect Mediterranean climate, while the West launched the insane crusades thousands of miles from home. Thus, fundamentally differing philosophies won out over this whole process. Socrates, followed by Aristotle perfecting it, pushed what amounted to a fundamentally aristocratic philosophy, which worked best for the aesthetically driven Apollonian classical civilization built around maximizing wisdom. Meanwhile, Rousseau and other thinkers like John Locke, Marx, and the like pushed a populist materialist worldview that empowered the merchant classes. The best comparison for what happened in the classical world is, say, the Kaiser, the French nobility, and the like. One, while in the West, it would be Athens, the merchant classes, and the pre-Socratic materialists. Classical civilization is one where Carl Jung beat Freud. These created differing social problems in classical and Western civilization. Both of these societies saw declines in religion, growing scale, and massive social problems that had very similar philosophies, with ancient Greece having communists, who did sometimes seize political power, nihilists, Epicureans, or those who look solely for physical pleasure, materialists, statists, and all that. However, the biggest social problems were different between these two. In the classical world of Greece and Rome, as befit an aristocratic society, the biggest problem was slavery. Classical civilization practiced slavery on a truly massive level, so much so that they never really used the steam engine or elementary computers, both of which they invented, since slave labor was so cheap. As I've said before in other videos, slavery is one of the worst things a society can ever do for its own development for a bunch of reasons, and slavery is really a social cancer. The aristocratic ideals of their society viewed using science for practical gain as immoral and ungentlemanly, thus holding back classical science and the further development of their civilization. Meanwhile, the Western world went full throttle for trade and science, throwing away the power of abstract concepts that the Greeks and the Romans held onto, and thus started to see social collapse stemming from the collapse of abstract moral standards. Horrifying totalitarian regimes like the Nazis and the Communists seized power, killing tens of millions, while all social ties, whether that between men and women, differing races, or between elite and commoners, broke down without cultural consensus to agree upon. For both the classical and Christian worlds, they fought off giant neighboring Middle Eastern empires of the Persians and Turks that they barely defeated by forming giant alliances, followed by the decay and decadence of those civilizations. However, as these civilizations went into decline, with their superior militaries, the Greeks and Westerners conquered the decadent Eastern civilizations like the Persians, Babylonians, Egyptians, Indians, Muslims, or China, occurring insanely rapidly over the late 19th century, or Alexander's invasions, which people didn't see coming. Both the Europeans and the Greeks established colonial empires, which they explicitly viewed as endeavors to push their more advanced civilization, and which they succeeded in converting the colonial ruling classes, but not the populations to their culture. The differing Greek states like the Ptolemies, Bactrians, Seleucids, and Antiochids fought over the colonies in the same way that the British, French, Russians, and the sort fought over their Asian and African colonial empires. At the same time, back home in both Europe and the Greek city-states, there were horrifying wars inside their civilizations, or the Peloponnesian and World Wars that broke their spirit as proud societies. Both of these wars took decades and were fought between the naval, colonial, and democratic British or Athenians against the land-based militaristic monarchy of Sparta and Germany. However, Britain is an island and Athens is not, and the British won in our world, thus making the West democratic, mercantile, and capitalist, while the classical world became aristocratic, militarist, and monarchist, in the same way a Europe under the Kaiser would have been. Something I had to throw in here is the people in each stage of civilization in which the West harkened back to the classical world. The West legitimately fanboyed that era of classical civilization. In this whole era, the Europeans styled themselves as heir to the Greeks, with it often being even more heavy-handed, like the British claiming a cultural kinship with the Athenians. And as we'll see later, the Americans did so with the Roman Republic. The details here get kind of fuzzy. Like, the best analog I can think of for Macedon is Russia, being a half-barbarian giant kingdom to the north. However, if the modern West directly matched the classical world, we would have seen the Germans beat the British in the World Wars, followed by Tsarist Russia crushing the whole European subcontinent, and then launching a giant land invasion of Asia, seizing all of China and India, which, God, sounds awesome, but that's not the case in our real history. You do have an Alexander quality general in Europe on a similar timescale, but he's Napoleon and didn't fit the same role. Likewise, you start to see more differences here. Western Europe, for a bunch of complex reasons, had the Industrial Revolution, which Greece did not. The Greek states of the known world had a massive trade revolution during the Hellenistic era, which matches up to the Industrial era, but it wasn't to anything close to the same degree. This further accentuated the differences mentioned before between the classical and Western worlds, or that between the West sacrificing cultural stability for greater equality and wealth, that being the industrial world. For example, the Europeans made a quantum leap in science and standard of living that the Greeks did not. However, we have no equivalent philosopher to Aristotle in the 19th or 20th centuries. Aristotle codified all knowledge into a unified theory to give people's views of the world some sense. This didn't happen since the cultural and technological changes of the Industrial Revolution were way too big, so that people weren't making expansive and combining theories because they were way too overwhelmed trying to figure out the new world. As the great philosopher Will Durant said, the problem with the classical world was too little evidence and too many theories to explain its meaning, and in the modern West we have too much evidence and not a lot of broader theories to make sense of it. This lack of moral direction caused far worse totalitarianism in the modern West that really had no parallel in classical civilization. In both societies, however, you saw an incredibly rapid decline in religion, the rise of feminist movements, and the rise of first Epicureanism and then nihilism as dominant philosophies, with postmodernism and cynicism being similar in saying all other philosophies are lies, and you should just jack off in the street. First, with these bloody internal wars, you saw the breakdown of both Greece and Europe. In both cases, Italy or North America and the Asian former colonies grew at the expense of the old Greek or European heartlands, which declined in economic importance. As the Greeks and Europeans fought each other and lost their vigor, it allowed an anti-colonial native resistance in the African and Asian colonies, or among the Parthians and Jews in the Hellenistic East. You even see a similar political trajectory with monarchies turning to aristocratic democracies. Then with expanding the political franchise, you saw and the rise of a welfare state in both Europe and Greece, which then allowed the rise of communist revolutionaries who wanted to divide everything. You saw dictatorships replace democracies in both Europe and Greece until they both greeted the Europeans and Americans as liberators, which leads us to the next segment. Now here we get to the main point of the comparisons between the US and the Roman Republic. Now let's start with the key difference. That the United States is a country of direct European ancestry that was ported abroad, while the Romans were just an ethnic group that was pretty close, all things considered, to the Greeks, and part of a roughly similar cultural proximity. However, both America and Rome are nations built off driving out the kings and establishing a republic. The American Republic was consciously modeled off the Roman system, for Christ's sake, which is why it shares institutions like the Senate. The early American Republic tried to learn as many lessons as possible from the Roman system, such as combining an aristocratic and populist branch of the legislature, in America being the Senate and the House, being wary of professional militaries, and lots of checks and balances between different branches of the government to prevent tyranny. The early Americans and Romans both cared a tremendous amount about political freedom, or keeping their tyrants from seizing power. Both put an extremely high value on their legal liberties and their ancient law codes, which originate from their founding, which are viewed in nearly religious terms. In America's case, that being the Constitution, in Rome's their legal code. Both societies prize justice and rule of law as some of their dominant virtues. Both the Americans and Romans shared the same can-do spirit. In Rome, this manifested more so in war and manliness, in which the Romans showed an implacable spirit and willingness to face death and suffering, with a determination that shocked everyone else. An example of this is in the Punic Wars, in which the Romans had to build a navy from scratch to fight the Carthaginians, who were the dominant naval power and had been for centuries. And the Romans invented a totally new type of naval technology, built a navy with absolutely no experience, lost tens of thousands of lives in failed navies, but kept pushing. Another example of this implacable can-do Roman spirit was with a population of only 5 million under their rule. They lost 3 battles in the Second Punic War, of over 60,000 men in each battle, and a majority of their male upper class, but the Romans kept fighting until they won the war. America is similar with its own famous can-do spirit, which manifested more so in technology and economics than strictly war. Although Americans have often been ruthless in waging war in the same way the Romans have been, and both countries are in competition to be the best engineers ever. Examples of the American can-do spirit include building the Transcontinental Railroad, feeding millions of starving Europeans, and rebuilding Western Europe's economy after the World Wars, America's massive technological breakthroughs, and all that stuff. The Americans have had a similarly tough reputation to the Romans, but this manifested more so in the cowboy and frontiersman fighting nature, rather than the legionary fighting savage barbarians, due to the nature of both societies' frontiers they are pushing against. Another similarity is the compound ethnic group, in that not that many Americans are descendant from the first people who settled in Jamestown or came off the Mayflower. In the same way, not many people in the Roman Empire were descendant from the men who founded the village of Rome under Romulus and Remus. The average white American is an amalgam of English, German, Scottish, Irish, and half a dozen other ethnicities, while the Romans assimilated countless local peoples like the Etruscans, Samnites, Narnians, real ethnic group, Campanians, and the like. Both the Romans and Americans are some of the best assimilators, starting out with ethnically similar peoples like the white immigrants to America in the 19th century, and the local Italian peoples, and then followed by the populations of their vast empires. Both the United States and Rome remained deeply socially conservative and religious in their founding years. America's forefounders were often religious fanatics, like the Puritans, Quakers, Cavaliers, and other hard-headed Englishmen, while the founders of Rome were equally stoic and religious. Early America and Rome were both rural, culturally homogenous, incredibly socially conservative. Both had incredibly strong senses of patriotism, more so than almost any other competing nations of their era. Both Rome and America stayed religious for centuries longer than the Greeks and the Romans, and viewed their nations as vehicles for divine plans and themselves as God's chosen people. Both cultures scorned luxury and reveled in manly toughness in their early years. Both cultures viewed the arts, fine cuisine, and the like as luxuries that promoted weakness. These were societies that held very tough cultural lines, in which the elite were supposed to serve their societies rather than surrendering themselves to decadence. Both were deeply patriarchal societies, in which women did not have a lot of cultural influence in the early period. An example of the moral fiber of both societies is the comparison between Cincinnatus and George Washington. Cincinnatus was a leader in the early Roman Republic, who the Americans really liked because George Washington seemed so similar, so much so that the city of Cincinnati in Ohio is named after him. And both Washington and Cincinnatus were leaders that were in effect made dictators by their nations in order to save them from an existential crisis in the early years of their foundation, but then they gave that power back to the people and just went back onto their farms because they weren't power hungry like that. A major similarity between the Romans and Americans is that they are good at changing out elites. Ibn Khaldun, one of the greatest historians in world history, said social elites largely became decadent after between 100 to 200 years on average. And Peter Turchin has proven this with modern science. Both America and Rome have been really skilled at shifting elites, thus allowing their empires to be very durable, once the previous elites become decadent, moving to another one. However, both the Europeans and the Greeks, their empires have largely fallen when their elites become decadent. However, even with all these similarities, there are three key differences between Rome and America that are worth pointing out. The first being geographic, in that America is very far removed from the rest of the global system, while Italy is in the middle of the map. The technological difference between the Romans and their neighbors, such as the Gauls and the Greeks, was basically nothing, meaning the Roman struggle was largely against other men to spread their empire. Meanwhile, the Native Americans were thousands of years less advanced, and America was largely empty, meaning the American struggle was more so against nature. America can leave and enter the world order whenever it pleases since it's so removed from it. Meanwhile, the Romans must militarily occupy all their neighbors in order for Italy to be safe. The second key difference being Christianity and Christian values. Christian values enforce a greater degree of respect for human life, which is missing in Rome's mass slavery and destruction of its provinces, while also pushing socially destabilizing forces like racial equity, feminism, and the like. The Romans, in many ways, were what America would be like if it was just the Confederate States, a predominantly agrarian-based slave economy, run by an aristocracy that would probably try to conquer Mexico and the Caribbean to turn them into serfs. The American and Western worlds have really dodged a bullet by not facing the horrifying social consequences of slavery, which have largely been diffused by Christian morality. This leaves American social stability in a better position than it was for the Romans. Likewise, due to the universalizing Christian values, America has much better cooperation than the Romans, whose religion was tied to individual locations. Thus, America has seen much better relations between its states than the Italian allied tribes, much less tension and all that sort of thing. America has also treated its subject peoples much better than the Romans, probably the best of any major empire ever. Just compare Carthage to Germany or Japan, where the Romans committed genocide against a peaceful country for revenge, while the US let Germany and Japan prosper under their local governments. The Romans constantly extorted and muddled in their subject nations' politics, while the US never really does it with its dependent countries. Finally, science has changed the dynamic. The US does not make vast amounts of money in conquering foreign territories. Conquering foreign territories was popular for Roman politicians, and they purposely did it to get votes. Meanwhile, in the US, unprompted foreign invasions are incredibly unpopular with the public. Instead, the US's massive economic gains are largely built through technological progress rather than looting foreign countries. America automates rather than importing millions of slaves. This continues the pattern of the US being less bloodthirsty, but also having more problems in its social contract than the Romans did. In their early centuries, the Americans and Romans filled in their core sea to shining sea territories, or Italy and the North American continent, largely fighting non-state tribal peoples and building alliances of co-ethnics in doing so. Thus, with both the two Punic and World Wars, they rose from local dominance to becoming the most powerful nation in the world, mostly unwittingly as a reluctant superpower. A minor atrocity caused in a mess of small states in the center of the geopolitical map, in Sicily and the Balkans, caused the First War, which escalated through a series of alliances, resulting in the Americans and Romans winning the war, but largely through winging it. However, the harsh terms of the treaty left the losing faction, the Carthaginians and Germans, bitter, then resulting in a militaristic, de facto dictator starting a war over a new territory to create living space elsewhere for their nation, being Spain or Poland, spiraling into the bloodiest war in history up to that point, being the Second Punic Wars or World War II. After mobilizing their insane population and economic power, the Americans and Romans were able to defeat the better generalship of the Romans and Carthaginians, ending in them eviscerating the enemy cities, as seen in Carthage as well as Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Something I will add is that the Second Punic War was much bigger in proportion than World War II, killing a majority of Rome's upper classes, being fought in Roman soil, and resulting in effective genocide of the Carthaginians as a race. However, World War II was close to 100 times the actual size, and so I'd say they're roughly parallel. A big similarity between the Punic and World Wars was that for both America and Rome, it was a two-front war in which America made giant gains to both its east and west against different civilizations or with Carthage and Greece. At the same time, it caused the implosion and loss of real independence for the Greeks or Europeans. The American entrance into Europe is incredibly similar to the Romans' entrance into Greece. The Romans viewed the democratic coastal southern Greeks as cultural cousins who had to be protected against the savage authoritarian Macedonians and Seleucids, who are almost a stand-in for America protecting Western Europe against the Germans and Soviets. The Americans didn't want to colonize Europe and the Romans Greece, but put military influence in there to protect them from tyranny, creating the Achaean League as an alliance against the Macedonians, kind of like NATO and the European Union against the Soviets. There were 3 Macedonian wars in which the Romans took progressively more control over Greece, kind of like the First and Second World Wars alongside the Cold War. We often have this stereotype of the Romans being stone-cold conquerors, but in reality they had many political debates and opinions that we would consider to be completely reasonable. Almost all the conquests the Romans made were defensive to the safety of Italy or one of their allies. It's similar to America, which almost rose to power unwittingly. In Rome, you had lots of conservatives who argued against wars and the bloodthirsty actions that they did. And there were even human rights concerned, where the Romans would complain of the corruption or violence their generals have done in the provinces. Both Rome and America had such inner strength that they just filled the room until they sucked up all the oxygen in their empires unwittingly. However, as I've said in my video on the future of Europe, as both the Greeks and Europeans lost cultural unity and energy, the Americans and Romans have gained more and more power, until both the Greeks and Europeans have become de facto colonies dependent upon the US's military, political, and economic power. Likewise, there was a mass diaspora of Greek philosophy, culture, and the like, as Italy replaced it as the main cultural center. This is like how America displaced Europe as the dominant cultural powerhouse over the 20th century, with enterprising Europeans immigrating to America. There was even widespread complaints of Greek nihilistic philosophy making the Romans weak and destroying their cultural unity, which sounds a lot like Americans complaining at Frankfurt School Marxists immigrating from Europe after World War II and their philosophy infiltrating American society, destroying traditional values and spreading nihilism. The Romans, after these victories, had what they called an era of gold, or after the Punic Wars, their era of vast wealth, in which they lost their religion and traditional values alongside seeing the collapse of their society. This is the equivalent of the West baby boomer generation, which, as I've explained in this video, has seen the collapse of the West's traditional moral structure as the post-war era was so wealthy. This era saw the collapse in birthrate, rise in sexual deviancy, skyrocketing inequality, and the like, similarly to the West's history since World War II. Orgies and sexual openness was no longer scorned. Feminism gained massive traction as women gained total legal equality, except for the vote. the divorce rate skyrocketed as well, and divorces became a normal thing. You even saw an equivalent to transgenderism, with some young slave boys cutting off their genitals and dressing as women for their master's pleasure. In both cases, inequality rose to dazzling heights as the benefits of empire were spread disproportionately. Large corporations gained larger and larger portions of the economy, and the wages of normal Romans were undercut by slave labor brought in from the empire, sort of like how we offshore businesses to Malaysia, China, or Mexico today, which in both societies crushed the previous middle classes, which then moved into cities and became a largely disassociated proletariat with no stake in society, who voted for populists and relied upon the welfare state, which ballooned. Immigrants, largely slaves, flooded into Italy, in 100 BC eating a third of the population, roughly equal to that of the foreign-born and their children in America today. From these metrics, we should roughly be in 120 BC today, as the Republic is decaying. I think a roughly good place to position ourselves is around the Gracchi brothers being Trump. The Gracchis were extremely wealthy populists bent on redistributing land and improving the station of the old Roman middle class that had been severely weakened by globalization and cheap foreign labor, and they were hated by entrenched elites. The Gracchis were assassinated, which didn't happen to Trump, but he definitely was invalidated by the establishment. A continuous theme here is that the American events are less bloody than the Roman, and so this parallel makes sense. At this point, I'm just going to say what happened after this point in Roman history and see what a similar comparison would be in America. And I'm just going to run with a scenario of Rome being the future of America. From this point in Roman politics for the next 80 years, you saw political assassinations common, and the two political parties, the optimates and populares, not accepting the other's right to power. As the political system of compromise broke down, military dictators and strongmen like Sulla and Marius seized power, purging Roman politics of their opponents. Eventually, a conservative dictator stabilized Rome 100 years after where we are now in the comparison. Rome stopped being a democracy at all, really, with Augustus maintaining the outward forms of a democracy. But then for his descendants, as even the memory of Rome being a democracy vanished, they became fully dictatorial and made fun of all of the former vestiges and ceremonial parts of the democracy that still were around. This would be the equivalent of each party not recognizing the other and America falling to different dictatorships, with the populares, whose closest parallel is the Democrat Party, spawning warlords who fight over the dying American Republic as they offer the public all kinds of welfare goodies for supporting them. The Romans then had a series of horrifying slave rebellions that they bloodily put down. America doesn't really have a close equivalent, maybe Mexican migrant labor, but their kids naturalize and become Americans. And if we over-mechanize the economy so no one can work, maybe a Luddite rebellion against the machines and AI doing all the work. Rome's allied Italian republics rebelled as well, killing hundreds of thousands, which really doesn't have a good equivalent at all since America's states have equal political power, while Rome bossed its Italian subject states around. There was also an invasion of German barbarians into Italy, which also really has no good parallel, since the Brazilians aren't going to be attacking Texas anytime soon. Maybe Mexico industrializes and becomes a threat in the next 50 years? If we want to continue the theme of the problems of classical civilization stemming from slavery and the West from having technological progress too fast, instead of all these issues of social unfairness, America might instead see crises due to collapsed social traditions, such as birth rates not being able to stay constant and society having serious problems from that, or gender issues, or young men rebelling against social justice, and all that sort. Some nation in Eastern Europe, like Germany or Russia, launches a rebellion against NATO in the next few decades. This is a proxy for the North Anatolian Mithridates from Pontus, who launched a rebellion that briefly drove the Romans out of the Greek world, of the Balkans and Turkey, before being defeated. This seems pretty plausible to me. The Romans kept conquering for the next century and more, taking North Africa, Gaul or modern France, and the Eastern Mediterranean, and finally taking Egypt. This is a place where it's again difficult to compare, since all of Rome's conquests made geographic sense, since they were clustered around the Mediterranean. There's no similar position for the US, which already controls 75% of the world's economy in its sphere of influence, and thus can either conquer horribly poor areas like Africa that have no value, or giant overpopulated Asian countries like India or China that are difficult to manage and also don't have a lot of value. I guess Central America and Southeast Asia are areas that it would make sort of sense for America to conquer. Also, you have the whole Peter Zeihan argument that I think makes a decent amount of sense, that the US could just totally leave its entire world empire and stop being a policeman, and its economy would probably improve. And he thinks this will happen, and this is a massive difference between America and Roman's geostrategic position. Another problem we run into is that the Romans went through their crisis much more slowly than we did. The historian Peter Turchin has a really fascinating way to measure political cycles. The Romans took 500 years to build up to their late Republican crisis. America's current cycle only started 80 years ago, and even if you want to include the cycle before that, it was only 200 years ago. This means that America will push through its current cycle between 2 to 8 times as fast as the Romans did, which throws off every single one of these metrics. As you can see, these kinds of historic patterns are very easy to spot in retrospect, and pick out key events that match each other in the past. However, once you try to use it to look into the future, it gets much more difficult, since we don't know what's going to happen in the future at all. When we try to project the future from strictly following the historic pattern, it's hard. However, from our past, it seems plausible, though, that we'll follow a path pretty similar to the Romans, although its actual practical details will be difficult to predict. But the general direction would lead to America becoming a military dictatorship, followed by a slew of horrifying tyrants, and then sliding into a socialist authoritarian nightmare that eventually falls to Mexicans and Arabs around the 26th century. However, the trend of greater authoritarianism is worrying and something we can pick up through in our own time, as the power of the presidency has grown tremendously in the last century. In the 19th century, presidents were largely non-entities, while the Congress was the real ruler. Today, people don't really pay attention to local politics and less to the actual Congress. To end, what can we do to prevent this Roman path which involves us losing our freedoms? Here are a couple of my guesses from the Roman precedent. The first will be to respect the value of labor. The Romans pushing slavery was one of the top things that killed their society. America doesn't practice slavery, but it does many other similar things that crush the value of the American worker, whether AI, automation, offshoring, and the like, which crush American wages in the exact same way Gallic or Syrian slaves used to do so. Secondly, to stick to our traditional American values like freedom, truth, sexual propriety, and all that. The Romans were initially a very honorable and moral people, and then as they became wealthy, shoved all their values down the toilet. By the time you get the reigns of tyrants like Caligula or Nero, the Romans really believed in nothing. Values may feel like they don't exist, but in fact there are barriers against the arbitrary whims of rulers, since you have a shared conception about what your society will stand for. I find it worrying traditional American values like freedom, the truth, responsibility, and individualism seem to never be discussed anymore in popular culture. When I was a child, I heard about freedom and the truth all the time. Now they'll never be mentioned, and instead society focuses on woke stuff. The third thing would be respect for civilian power rather than defaulting upon military dictatorship like the Romans did. The Roman elite and political class became so morally corrupt that the only functioning organization that still existed was the army. Looking at our political parties and the cultural elite, I worry at the same thing for modern America, where a military dictatorship may look like a more and more reasonable option every day. The thing is that there were conservatives at the time of the decline of the Roman Republic who said the exact same things I've said here. Men like Cicero and Cato, who were totally correct and saw the direction things were going, who did not want to see their world fall to slavery and despotism. However, they were screaming into a lost cause. As Samuel Francis said out recent conservatism, beautiful losers. The difference between us and them is that the future still lies ahead of us to create. Let's prove that you can learn something from history.